You're listening to the Chapter a Day Bible Study. I'm John Stange, and today we're in Exodus 1. Pharaoh oppresses the people of Israel. The book of Exodus was written by Moses during Israel's wilderness years. Moses lived between 1520 and 1400 BC, so Exodus was written sometime during that 120-year period. Many biblical scholars place the date of writing somewhere between 1440 and 1400 BC. The book tells the story of how God rescued his people from slavery in Egypt and formed them into a covenant nation. It was written to remind Israel who their God is, how he saves, and why they belong to him, showing that their freedom wasn't earned, but it was given by the Lord's powerful and faithful hand. Exodus reveals God as the one who hears the cries of the oppressed and defeats false gods and chooses to dwell with his redeemed people, even after their repeated failures. All of this points forward to Jesus, the greater deliverer, who rescues his people from a deeper bondage to sin and establishes a new covenant through his blood and makes a way for God to dwell with us forever. Exodus opens with a reminder and a warning. God's promises are advancing, even when human power tries to crush them. Exodus 1 doesn't begin with miracles or plagues. It actually begins with names, families, pressure, fear, and faithful obedience in the middle of oppression. This chapter sets the stage for redemption by showing us what happens when God's people grow, when rulers panic, and when God quietly but firmly keeps his word. The chapter starts by listing the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. Verse 5 says, "All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons." That number matters. 70 went down into Egypt. Centuries later, a nation is taking shape. Verse 7 tells us, "But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them." This isn't accidental growth. It's covenant growth. God is keeping the promise he made to Abraham back in Genesis, when he said his offspring would be as numerous as the stars. Egypt may be the setting, but God is the one doing the work. Then the mood shifts. In verse 8 we read, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." Forgetfulness becomes dangerous when it's mixed with power. This new Pharaoh doesn't remember how Joseph saved Egypt. He only sees a growing population he can't control. Fear turns into policy. Suspicion turns into cruelty. Pharaoh says in verse 10, "Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply." When leaders fear losing control, they often justify injustice. And the response is forced labor. The Israelites are afflicted with what it says in verse 11, with heavy burdens. They build store cities. Their strength is exploited. And yet verse 12 tells us something Pharaoh didn't expect. There it says, "But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad." Oppression doesn't stop God's plan. It often exposes it. What Pharaoh meant for limitation, God used for expansion. As the pressure increases, the Egyptians work the Israelites ruthlessly. Their lives are made bitter with hard service. This isn't just economic exploitation, it's dehumanization. And when forced labor doesn't accomplish Pharaoh's goal, he escalates it again. He turns to infanticide. 2 Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, are commanded to kill the male children at birth. This is power at its ugliest, using authority to destroy life. But Exodus 1 introduces us to a theme that will carry through the entire book. God uses faithful obedience from unlikely people to undermine the plans of the powerful. Verse 17 says, "But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live." Again, notice the contrast. Pharaoh fears losing control. The midwives fear God. Their fear leads to courage. Their obedience leads to life. When questioned, they answer simply, and God honors their faith. Verse 20 says, "So God dealt well with the midwives." Their obedience didn't remove danger from Israel, but it did place them squarely in God's favor. The chapter ends with Pharaoh issuing a command to all his people. In verse 22, he says, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile." The threat now touches every household. Death hovers over new life. The situation initially looks hopeless, but Exodus 1 wants us to see something clearly. God's redemptive work often begins in dark places, where faithfulness matters more than strength. This chapter points us toward Jesus in several important ways. First, we see a pattern of a threatened ruler responding to fear by attacking children. Centuries later, another ruler, Herod, would feel threatened by the birth of a promised king. He would also order the death of children in an attempt to preserve his power. In both cases, God's plan moves forward anyway. Jesus survives Herod's rage, just as Israel survives Pharaoh's cruelty. Second, we see God's people suffering under a heavy burden, longing for deliverance. Exodus 1 creates a hunger for a rescuer, and that hunger is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. He steps into a world marked by oppression and sin, not with political force, but with obedient love. He identifies with the suffering of his people and leads a greater exodus, one that frees hearts, not just bodies. Third, the faithful obedience of the midwives reminds us that God often works through people who simply choose to fear him more than they fear consequences. Jesus himself models this perfectly. He obeys the Father fully, even when that obedience leads to suffering. Through his obedience, life is preserved and multiplied far beyond what any ruler could contain. Exodus 1 teaches us that God's promises are not fragile. They grow under pressure. They survive cruelty. They advance through faithfulness. And they ultimately find their fulfillment in Jesus Christ, the true deliverer, who entered a world hostile to God's purposes and overcame it, not by force, but by faithful obedience that brought life to many. Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Chapter a Day Bible Study. For more resources to help you in your walk with Christ and your understanding of the Bible, please visit my website at BibleStudyHeadquarters.com. And if you'd like to partner with me by becoming a supporter of this ministry, you'll see a few options to do so, again, at BibleStudyHeadquarters.com or in the description of this episode. As always, thank you for your prayers, thank you for your support, and thank you for your willingness to share this content with others. Have a great day, and I'll see you again right here tomorrow.